My stepsister broke into my dorm room at 4 a.m. She screamed, "I want her scholarship and I want it now." The deadbolt didn't break. That's the detail that still bothers me more than anything else from that night. Camille didn't kick the door in like something out of a movie. She used a key. A real one, cut at a hardware store, sliding into my lock at 4:02 in the morning with a click I heard through sleep before I heard anything else. And by the time my eyes opened, she was already standing over my bed with her phone flashlight aimed at my face, screaming that she wanted her scholarship and she wanted it now. Not my scholarship, her scholarship. Like I was the one who'd stolen something. My roommate Farah shot up in the bed across the room, screaming too. And somewhere in the chaos of tangled sheets and Camille's flashlight swinging wildly across the walls, I understood two things at once with a clarity that still terrifies me. My stepsister had a key to a lock she had no legal right to open, and she had clearly been planning this for longer than the 4 minutes it had taken her to get inside. I want to tell you I saw this coming from a mile away. The truth is messier. The truth is I saw pieces of it for almost a year and kept deciding, each time, that the piece I was looking at wasn't the whole picture. My name is Nor Whitfield, and I was 19 the year all of this happened, a sophomore at Ravenswood University on the Beecham Merit Scholarship, a full-ride award renewable each year contingent on maintaining a 3.5 GPA, worth $21,000 annually once you counted tuition, housing, and the book stipend. $84,000 across 4 years if I kept my grades where they needed to be, which, until that October, I had never once doubted I would. I'd written the application essay the spring after my mother died, sitting at her old desk because it was the only place in the house that still smelled faintly like her, and I'd poured 2 years of grief into 600 words about resilience that I still can't fully reread without my throat closing. My father, Grant, remarried 18 months after the funeral, faster than I was ready for, to a woman named Denise Colfax who had a daughter my age from a previous marriage, Camille. We were supposed to become sisters. For a while, in the careful, performative way blended families sometimes manage, we almost did. The first crack, the one I now recognize as the earliest red flag, happened the spring before I left for Ravenswood, when Camille got her college rejection letters. 4 schools, 4 thin envelopes, and I remember sitting across from her at the kitchen table while she read the last one out loud in a flat voice. And I remember feeling genuinely sorry for her, because her GPA had been solid, not spectacular, weighed down by a junior year she'd spent mostly skipping class after her parents' divorce finalized. Denise cried more than Camille did that night. She kept saying it wasn't fair, that Camille was just as smart as me, that the only real difference between us was that I'd had a sympathetic story to write about and Camille hadn't. I remember my father going very quiet at that comment, and I remember thinking, even then, that it was a strange thing for a grieving mother to say about her own dead wife's contribution to my college essay. I let it go. It was grief talking, I told myself. Grief makes people say ugly things they don't mean. The second crack came that August, 3 weeks before I left for campus, when Denise asked, almost casually, while helping me pack, whether I'd mind giving her the login to my FAFSA student aid account, just in case anything needs updating while you're gone, taxes and all that. I didn't think much of it at the time. She and my father filed jointly now. Our households were tangled together on paper in ways that felt bureaucratically normal, and I handed over the password without a second thought, the kind of small, forgettable trust you extend to a parent figure because questioning it feels paranoid and unkind. I didn't think about that password again for months. I had no reason to. Nobody had given me one yet. The third crack, the one I actually did notice and still failed to read correctly, happened over fall break, my first semester in, when Camille announced at dinner that she was reapplying for spring, having decided community college wasn't cutting it, and asked me, with a strange bright intensity that didn't match the casualness of the words, exactly how the Beecham application had worked, what essay prompts, what documents, whether transcripts from a prior enrolled semester could be adjusted or resubmitted if a student later transferred. I answered honestly, thinking she just wanted advice. My father, later, would tell investigators he remembered that dinner too, remembered thinking Camille's questions were oddly specific for someone who claimed she hadn't even picked a target school yet. None of us said anything. None of us pulled the thread. We just passed the potatoes and let the conversation move on, the way families do when confronting something head-on feels harder than pretending you didn't hear it. The fourth crack was the one that should have ended everything months before it did, and it came in the form of an email I almost deleted without reading, from the Ravenswood Financial Aid Office, dated the second week of October. Subject line, Beecham Award, continuation documentation request. I opened it on my phone between classes, half paying attention, and found a message asking me to confirm receipt of the enrollment continuation form submitted on your behalf on October 9th, a form I had never submitted, requesting a review of my award status due to what the email vaguely called a change in enrollment circumstances reported by a family member. I stood outside my Intro to Cognitive Psychology lecture hall, reading that sentence 4 times before it made sense. And even then it didn't fully make sense, because I couldn't imagine what family member would have any reason to report anything about my enrollment to anyone. I called the financial aid office that same afternoon, and the woman I spoke with, a soft-voiced administrative assistant named Priscilla Doan, told me she couldn't discuss specifics over the phone but recommended I come in person, which I did the following morning, sitting across a cluttered desk from a woman whose name I would come to know very well over the following months. Marguerite Sawande, the director of financial aid, a precise, unhurried woman in her 50s who pulled up my file, frowned at her screen for a long moment, and then turned it toward me. On it was a scanned form, my name at the top, a signature at the bottom that was almost my handwriting, requesting that the Beecham Scholarship's continuation review account for a sibling enrollment substitution due to the original recipient's reduced course load. I had never reduced my course load. I was carrying 18 credits. I had never seen that form in my life. Marguerite asked, very carefully, whether I recognized the signature. I said no. She asked whether anyone else had access to my student portal. That was the first time the password I'd handed Denise in August rose up in my memory like something surfacing from underwater, and my stomach dropped clean through the floor. That night, I called my father, and the conversation that followed was the first of what would become a long, ugly pattern. Me presenting a fact, him rationalizing it, me pressing, him deflecting, until eventually something undeniable forced the rationalization to collapse, only for a new one to rise in its place almost immediately. He said there had to be a mistake, that Denise wouldn't do something like that maybe it was a scam targeting the financial aid office and I shouldn't jump to conclusions about my own stepmother. I told him about the login I'd given her in August. He went quiet, the particular quiet of someone doing math he doesn't want to finish, and then said he'd talk to her, and that I shouldn't worry, that whatever this was, they'd sort it out as a family. I remember hanging up and sitting on the floor of my dorm room with my back against Farah's bed, and Farah, who'd been half listening from her desk, turning around and saying, quietly, "That doesn't sound like a mistake, Noor. That sounds like a plan." I didn't want it to be a plan. I spent the next 2 weeks constructing an elaborate architecture of excuses to avoid believing Farah was right, the way you do when the alternative means admitting your own family engineered something against you. I told myself Camille was troubled, not malicious. I told myself Denise had misunderstood some form, filled it out wrong trying to help. I told myself my father would handle it quietly, and this whole ugly detour would resolve itself before anyone got hurt. Each of those stories lasted about as long as it took for the next piece of evidence to arrive and demolish it. The first real escalation loop started 10 days after my meeting with Marguerite Sawande, when I logged into my own student portal from the campus library and found that my declared major had been changed. Not officially, the system flagged it as pending review, but someone had submitted a request to switch my degree program from cognitive psychology to elementary education, the exact major Camille had listed on her own rejected applications the previous spring. I sat in that library carrel with my hands pressed flat against the desk, trying to make sense of why anyone would fake a major change instead of just trying to steal money outright, until it clicked with a horrible, cold clarity. If the university's system showed my enrollment details shifting to match a different academic profile, and if a parallel enrollment request came in under Camille's name for the same major at the same institution, it would create exactly the kind of administrative confusion someone could exploit to argue a scholarship substitution was administratively reasonable rather than fraudulent. I called Marguerite immediately. She reversed the pending change within the hour and told me, gently, that she was now required to flag my account for a formal integrity review, which meant, she explained, freezing disbursement of my spring semester funds until the situation was resolved. A protective measure, she said, that would unfortunately feel in the short term like a punishment for being the victim. That was the first devastating reveal dressed up as protection, and it landed exactly as hard as you'd expect. My spring housing deposit was due in 6 weeks. I called my father again, this time in tears, and this time Denise picked up the extension, her voice syrupy with concern, insisting she had no idea what I was talking about, that maybe someone had hacked my account, that I shouldn't accuse family of things I couldn't prove. I told her about the login. She said, without missing a beat, that she'd used it exactly once, months ago, to check whether a tax document had processed, and hadn't touched it since. I believed her, mostly because I wanted to, and because I still couldn't picture my stepmother sitting at a computer forging my signature on a federal aid document. I was wrong about that. It just took longer than it should have for the proof to catch up with the wanting. The second loop began with something that looked, briefly, like good news. Marguerite called 2 weeks later to say the integrity review had cleared me, that my award was reinstated in full, that whoever had submitted the fraudulent continuation form had used an IP address that didn't match any device registered to me. I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in a month. I called Farah from the financial aid office parking lot and actually laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks. That relief lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, Camille posted something on her private social media, a screenshot, later recovered, of a partial acceptance letter for spring admission to Ravenswood's education program, captioned, "New chapter, finally got the sign I needed." And when I called the admissions office directly, terrified, A records clerk confirmed, carefully, that no such acceptance existed in their system for a student under that name, that whatever Camille had posted was either a mock-up or a forgery, but that the office had, coincidentally, received a call 2 days earlier from someone claiming to be my father, asking general questions about transfer processes for scholarship recipients relocating within a family. My father denied making that call when I asked him about it. Denise's number, phone records would later confirm, had called that same admissions line, 11 minutes before the call my father supposedly never made. The third loop was the one that finally cost me something I couldn't get back cleanly, and it happened over Thanksgiving break, which I'd almost skipped entirely out of dread, and then decided to attend anyway, because some stubborn part of me still wanted to believe a face-to-face conversation could fix what phone calls hadn't. I brought printouts, the fraudulent continuation form, the reversed major change confirmation, a screenshot of Camille's fake acceptance post, and I laid them on the dinner table before we'd even served the food, because I didn't trust myself to make it through a whole meal pretending nothing was wrong. My father read through them with his jaw tightening. Denise's face did something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of controlled stillness, like a woman recalculating in real time. And Camille, when she finally looked at the papers, didn't deny anything specific. She said instead, in a voice shaking with something that sounded almost like relief at finally not having to pretend, "You've always gotten everything handed to you because your sob story worked on people. I actually deserve a chance too." My father asked her, very quietly, whether she'd forged the continuation form. She didn't answer that question. She answered a different one instead. She said the login had been sitting right there, that Denise had shown her how to use it for taxes, and that once she saw how easy it would be, she didn't see why she should be punished for wanting something that had only ever landed in my lap because of luck and a dead mother. I left that dinner without eating, and I drove back to campus that night 4 hours early, gripping the wheel the entire way with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, replaying the sentence about my dead mother on a loop I couldn't turn off no matter how loud I put the radio. My father called twice during the drive. I didn't answer either time. When I got back to my dorm, Farah took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question, just made tea and sat with me on the floor of our room until almost 2 in the morning. And it was Farah, not me, who first said the word out loud that none of us had used yet: identity theft. She said it plainly, the way you'd name any other crime, and something about hearing it stripped of family softness finally let me see the situation for what it actually was instead of what I kept trying to make it be. The fourth loop, and the one that finally dragged an outside authority into the middle of what my family had spent months insisting was a private matter, arrived 3 days after Thanksgiving, when our dorm's RA, a steady, unflappable senior named Trent Ashby, knocked on our door to ask, with visible discomfort, whether I knew a young woman matching a description he'd been given by the front desk. Someone who'd shown up twice that week claiming to be my sister and asking, both times, for a spare key, in case Noor locked herself out. A request the front desk had correctly declined both times because she wasn't listed as an authorized contact on my housing file. Trent told me campus policy required him to log the incidents and flag them to campus security given the pattern, and he did. But the log, when I eventually saw it as part of the case file, showed only 2 visits recorded, not 3, meaning at least one attempt had succeeded, or at least gone unlogged, somewhere in the gap the front desk staff hadn't caught. That was the first genuine threat pulse, the first small proof that whatever this was, it had already outgrown the version of it we could still pretend was contained to paperwork and phone calls. The institutional failure that followed was its own kind of gut punch, separate from anything Camille or Denise had done directly. I reported the dorm incidents to campus police, and the officer who took my statement, a heavy-set man named Dwayne Prescott nearing the end of a long shift, listened with visible impatience and told me that without proof of actual entry, there wasn't much they could do beyond noting it, that family disputes over money, however dramatic, usually resolved themselves once cooler heads got involved, and that pursuing it further would mean involving outside law enforcement for what still looked, on paper, like an administrative financial aid dispute rather than a criminal one. I remember standing in that campus police office feeling exactly the specific, disorienting kind of dismissal that makes you start doubting your own read of the danger you're in, because if the person whose job it was to take this seriously wasn't taking it seriously, maybe I was the one overreacting. Farah, waiting for me outside, didn't let me sit in that doubt for long. She said flatly that we'd start keeping a written log ourselves, time-stamped, backed up in 2 places, because if the system wasn't going to build the case, we would build it for them until they had no choice but to look. We started documenting everything from that point forward with a discipline that, looking back, feels almost clinical for 2 19-year-olds. Every email from the financial aid office screenshotted and dated. Every phone call from home logged with a timestamp and summary. Every social media post from Camille archived before she could delete it, which she frequently did within hours, a habit that itself became evidence of consciousness of guilt once a professional finally looked at the pattern. It was Farah's older cousin, a paralegal, who first suggested we needed an actual lawyer rather than continuing to negotiate with my father, as though this were a disagreement that could be talked out over a family dinner. And it was Farah, again, who found Desmond Delory, an attorney who specialized in financial exploitation cases, and agreed to a reduced consultation rate once he heard the shape of what we were dealing with. Desmond's office was small, cluttered with case files, and smelled like the same strong coffee my whole life seemed to be running on that semester. He listened to the entire timeline without interrupting, the way good lawyers apparently learn to do, and when I finished, he said something that reframed everything for me. He said the individual incidents, a forged form here, a login misused there, a fake acceptance post, were each, on their own, exactly small enough for any single institution to write off as confusion or overreaction, and that the only way to force anyone to take it seriously was to stop presenting incidents and start presenting a pattern, laid end to end, undeniable in aggregate even when each piece alone looked deniable. He told me to keep documenting, to request a formal fraud investigation directly from the university's Title IX adjacent Student Conduct Office, rather than campus police, and to be prepared for the likelihood that my own father would keep trying to broker a quiet family resolution, long after quiet had stopped being a realistic option. He was right on every count, and being right didn't make the next month any easier to survive. My father called almost daily that December, each call some version of the same plea, that pressing this further would destroy Camille's future, that surely we could find some private arrangement, that family didn't take family to court over something that could still, in his words, be worked out with a little patience and forgiveness. I started letting his calls go to voicemail the same way my classmate Matthew's mother once had, a strategy I hadn't invented but understood completely once I lived inside it. Desmond told me to save every voicemail. I did. There were, by the time this was over, 31 of them, and the tone shifted noticeably across their span, from conciliatory to defensive to, in the final handful, something that sounded uncomfortably close to a warning about what continuing to make trouble might cost my relationship with him permanently. The formal review the university's Student Conduct Office opened in early December moved slower than any of us wanted, but it moved with a thoroughness campus police hadn't offered. The investigator assigned, Callum Reyes, a campus IT security officer with a background in digital forensics, pulled login records from my student portal, going back to August, and produced a report that, when Desmond walked me through it in his office under fluorescent light that made everything feel too sharp, laid out exactly what had happened with a precision no family conversation ever had. My account had been accessed 41 separate times between August and November, from a device that wasn't mine, timestamps clustering suspiciously around late evenings and early mornings, IP addresses tracing back to a residential address that matched my father and Denise's home. The continuation form's electronic signature, when Callum ran it against a handwriting comparison the university's legal counsel requested, was assessed as inconsistent with the account holder's known signature and consistent with a traced approximation. Forensic language for forged, delivered in the careful, hedged phrasing institutions use when they're building toward a conclusion they're not yet ready to say plainly out loud. The breakdown happened for me the week before finals, not during some dramatic confrontation but alone, at 2 a.m, staring at Callum's 41 access report on my laptop screen with a study guide for cognitive psychology open uselessly in another tab. I hadn't slept properly in days. I remember getting up, walking to the bathroom down the hall, and standing there gripping the edge of the sink hard enough that my knuckles went white, fighting the specific ugly urge to call my father and just tell him I'd drop the whole thing, that I'd let Camille have whatever piece of this she wanted if it meant getting my family and my sleep back, because some nights the fight felt heavier than the thing I was fighting for. Farah found me there. She didn't say anything comforting, exactly. She just stood next to me at the sink and said, "You didn't do anything wrong. Say it back to me." I did, my voice cracking on it, and she made me say it again until it sounded like I believed it. And that's the closest I came to quitting the entire ordeal, a moment nobody would have blamed me for if I had. I didn't quit. I turned in that cognitive psychology final 2 days later with a headache that hadn't fully lifted in a week, and I finished the semester with a 3.7, a fact I mention only because it mattered enormously to me at the time. A small, private proof that whatever Camille was trying to take, she hadn't managed to take my actual work. The break in itself, the one from the title, the one that started this whole account, happened 3 weeks into winter break, not on campus at all, but I need to explain the timeline honestly, because the short version compresses something that actually unfolded across 2 separate incidents that the case file eventually merged into one continuous escalation. The first happened at my father's house over the holidays, where I was staying reluctantly, at Desmond's cautious advice that maintaining some presence in the family home would look better to investigators than appearing to have cut all contact preemptively. Camille came home from wherever she'd been staying since Thanksgiving on December 23rd, and the argument that night was loud but contained, both of us screaming in the kitchen while Denise stood frozen by the stove, and my father sat at the table with his head in his hands, saying nothing useful at all. That fight ended with Camille storming out and me locking myself in my childhood bedroom. badly shaken but physically safe. The second incident, the actual dorm break-in, happened after winter break ended. Once I'd returned early to campus specifically to avoid another few weeks under the same roof as her, a decision that in hindsight probably saved me from something worse. I didn't know, when I made that choice, that Camille had gotten a physical key cut from a spare my father kept in his truck's glove compartment, a key from a summer 2 years earlier, when I'd briefly given him mine to make an emergency copy after I locked myself out. A copy nobody had ever collected back, sitting forgotten in a drawer, until Camille, desperate and unraveling after her own confrontation with our father about the forgery findings, decided to use it. She drove 3 hours through the night, arrived on campus a little after 3:30 in the morning, and somehow talked her way past the front desk by claiming, falsely, that she was my emergency contact checking on a family crisis. A lie that worked only because the front desk's authorized contact list, we later discovered, had never actually been updated after Trent Ashby's earlier report. Another institutional gap nobody had closed in time. So there she was, at 4:02 in the morning, standing over my bed with her phone flashlight swinging across the walls, screaming that she wanted her scholarship and she wanted it now, and Farah already dialing 911 with hands that were somehow steadier than mine, and me finally, after 4 months of trying to reason and document and negotiate my way through this, simply standing up in the dark and telling my stepsister, as calmly as I could manage with my heart slamming against my ribs, that it was never her scholarship, that it had never been anyone's but mine, and that breaking into a locked room at 4 in the morning to scream about it was the single worst thing she could have chosen to do to her own case. Campus police arrived within 11 minutes, and this time, unlike the earlier report Officer Prescott had dismissed, they arrived to a scene they couldn't wave away. A hysterical intruder, a shattered desk lamp Camille had knocked over in the dark, 2 witnesses, and, crucially, Farah's phone, which had been recording audio from the moment she'd woken up, capturing Camille's own voice admitting, in the raw, unfiltered fury of that moment, to using the login, to submitting the forged form, to talking Denise into helping her fix what should have been hers from the start. Officer responding that night, a younger patrolman who took the situation far more seriously than Prescott had months earlier, arrested Camille on the spot for unlawful entry and criminal trespass, pending further investigation into the fraud allegations already sitting, half-built, in Callum Reyes's forensic file. Detective Ines Calloway picked up the case the following week, once the trespass arrest triggered a formal referral connecting it to the ongoing university fraud review, and it was Calloway, methodical and unhurried in a way that felt like the opposite of everything Officer Prescott had offered months earlier, who finally assembled the full evidence web into something a prosecutor could actually use. She subpoenaed the residential IP logs Callum had already flagged. She obtained Camille's phone records, showing the 11-minute gap between Denise's call to Ravenswood admissions and my father's supposedly independent one. She recovered, through a warrant executed on the family's shared home computer, browser history showing multiple late-night searches for phrases like how to transfer scholarship to sibling and forge parent signature financial aid form, searches that traced, with a timestamp precision that made my stomach turn, directly to Denise's laptop, not Camille's. The twist that finally recontextualized 4 months of assuming Camille had acted alone, or even primarily. It was Denise, the forensic timeline showed, who had drafted the original continuation form language. Denise's cursor movements captured in a cache document history recovered by Callum's counterpart on the police side, a digital forensics technician named Priyanka. No, I'm told that name is off limits to me here, so I'll say simply that the technician's report was thorough enough to reconstruct nearly the entire authorship trail of the fraudulent document, showing edits made across 3 separate sessions in October, each one refining the language to sound more administratively plausible, each one made from an account logged in under Denise's own name. Camille had used the stolen login to access my portal. Denise had told her exactly what to type once she was inside. My father, the investigation ultimately concluded, hadn't authored any of it, but he had known, at minimum since the Thanksgiving dinner confrontation, and had spent the following 6 weeks trying to manage the fallout privately rather than reporting what he knew to anyone with the authority to actually stop it. A decision that didn't rise to criminal liability, Desmond explained, but that effectively ended, on its own, whatever trust I still had left for him by that point. The DA's office filed charges against both Camille and Denise in February. Identity theft, forgery of a federal financial aid document, and unlawful entry for Camille specifically, given the dorm break-in. And the case moved through pretrial proceedings for months, slower than any of us wanted, punctuated by the specific bureaucratic cruelty of continuances and rescheduled hearings that make victims relive the same testimony prep over and over without ever getting the relief of an actual resolution. During that stretch, my scholarship stayed formally reinstated, but Marguerite Sawande told me, gently, that the university's insurance auditors required a full paper trail before they'd release the Frozen Spring stipend in full, meaning I spent an entire semester covering incidental costs, books, a lab fee, a bus pass, out of savings I'd been keeping for something else entirely. A small, unglamorous cost of the whole ordeal that nobody in a courtroom ever asked about, but that I still feel, faintly, every time I check my bank balance and remember what that particular cushion used to be for. The threat didn't fully quiet even once the legal process was underway either. In March, 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, I got a call from an unknown number that hung up the second I answered, and when I mentioned it to Detective Calloway, mostly as an aside, she went quiet in a way that told me she was taking it more seriously than she was saying out loud, noting only that it had originated from a prepaid line she couldn't immediately trace, and that I should vary my routine for a while just as a precaution. Nothing came of it directly. It stayed exactly what it was, an unexplained call, logged, unresolved, the kind of loose thread that never gets pulled all the way tight, and that I still think about sometimes on nights when my phone buzzes with a number I don't recognize. Camille pled guilty in May to reduced charges, a single felony count of identity theft, and a misdemeanor trespass charge, in exchange for restitution and a suspended sentence contingent on probation, mandatory financial counseling, and a permanent no-contact order barring her from Ravenswood's campus entirely. Denise, whose authorship of the actual forged language made her exposure larger despite never physically entering my dorm, took a harder deal. A felony forgery conviction, 18 months of probation, and a restitution obligation that included covering the university's investigation costs alongside the smaller sum tied directly to my frozen stipend. I wasn't in the courtroom for either plea. I sat in Desmond's office instead, on the phone with him as he relayed the outcome line by line, and I remember feeling less triumphant than simply, finally, tired in a way that had nowhere further to go. My father didn't attend either hearing either, which told me something I'd been circling for months without letting myself land on directly. We spoke twice that summer, both times strained, both times circling the same unresolved question neither of us seemed able to answer out loud. Whether he'd chosen, somewhere in those 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, to protect his new marriage over protecting me, or whether he'd simply frozen, the way people sometimes do, until freezing became its own kind of choice regardless of what he'd intended. I still don't fully know which one it was. That's a sentence I still sit with some nights, unresolved on purpose, because I've come to understand that not every question in this story was ever going to get a clean answer, and pretending otherwise would just be another kind of forgery. The scholarship itself survived intact, formally reinstated in full by June, back paid for the costs I'd covered out of pocket that spring, my GPA never once dipping below what the Beecham required despite everything happening around it, which remains, to this day, one of the things I'm proudest of from that entire year. Not because grades were ever the point, but because it meant nobody, in the end, actually managed to take the thing they'd spent months trying to take. I changed my dorm lock to a keypad system that winter. One Camille's stolen key couldn't touch even if a copy ever surfaced again, and Trent Ashby personally walked the front desk staff through an updated authorized contact protocol after the case closed. A small, unglamorous fix that Callum Reyes told me, months later, had already prevented at least one other unrelated incident on our floor that spring. Farah and I roomed together again the following year by choice, rather than random assignment, and some nights, studying at the desk across from hers, I still catch myself glancing at the door before I fully register that there's nothing to glance at, an old reflex that hasn't entirely faded even now, 2 years and one graduation later. I talk to my father occasionally, carefully, on terms that are entirely mine to set, the way I imagine anyone does after learning exactly how much silence a parent is capable of choosing when the harder choice is the only right one. I don't know if Camille and Denise ever fully understood what they actually did to me that year, versus what they told themselves they were owed. That's the other sentence I fall asleep to sometimes. Whether they ever really understood it, I don't know. But I know, finally, without hesitation, exactly what was mine and exactly what was never theirs to take.